Today I'm talking to Danny Dorling, Professor of Human Geography at the University of Sheffield and perhaps the foremost expert on health and wealth inequalities in Britain. His latest book, Injustice, moves on to new territory. Instead of just describing inequality, he critiques the belief system which underpins it. How unequal is Britain today?
Britain is back to the level at least of the 1920s and in some ways as unequal as Victorian times. Now, it doesn't mean it's like Victorian times. Obviously, people are much better off than Victorian times, but it means the gap between different groups has again got as wide as Victorian times in certain ways in terms of wages, and has gone back at least to the 1920s in terms of health inequalities.
Is it growing?
It's not just growing, the rate of growth in the gap is accelerating, which is particularly interesting because that is not sustainable.
Does any of this matter if we're all getting wealthier and healthier overall?
Well, we're not getting as healthy as most people in most rich countries are. In terms of wealth inequalities, what happens is that people get into debt to try and keep up with the people just above them. They too get into debt to keep up with people just above them, and so on until you get to the 1,000 richest people, most of whom don't feel that well off because the best of 10 people at the top are so much richer than the other 990.
Over the last 13 years, we've had a Labour government and we've had an array of initiatives to reduce health inequalities, Sure Start, minimum wage, child tax credit. Have any of them made a dent in the gap between rich and poor?
They'll have made a dent, but it literally is a dent in that it's just about visible. For instance, the minimum wage, America's had a minimum wage for much longer, and it's a minimum, it's very, very low. So it has a tiny effect, but it's hard to think of something which has a smaller effect. Sure Start is replacing what people used to be able to do for themselves in the 1970s when they could organise their own playgroups. And they're actually things that you'd expect any decent country to do anyway, not something you'd step back and say, aren't we great, look, we managed to do a minimum wage. You ought to be saying, what else are you doing?
In your new book, you examine 5 beliefs which you say uphold and maintain inequality. Can you talk me through them?
What I've tried to do is try to work out why it's much harder to reduce inequalities even when you begin to accept that inequality is bad for almost everyone. One big problem we have is that in unequal countries, and the UK and the USA are two of the most unequal in the rich world, people's actual thinking gets altered. You begin to believe things, or many more people begin to believe things which they didn't used to believe, and which aren't believed in most countries, in most rich countries. And these beliefs lead to inequalities being seen in many ways as natural or inevitable. The 5 are a belief in elitism, a belief that some people are especially able when you spend a lot on their education and much less on other people's. An idea that exclusion is necessary and natural. There will always be a large group of people excluded from the norms of society because they're poor. We may try and help them or help poor children, but there will be a feckless group of adults who really need to be punished to work, and another group of super rich who naturally will be excluded, and that's natural. The third belief is a kind of prejudice about people, which links to that one, but the idea that some people are supremely able and other people have something wrong with them, which means that they're not really of much use. And this evil leads to us accepting about 1 million young people being unemployed because they're not worth paying. It's not that we haven't had enough money. We've had enough money in the national wage packet to have employed these people, very, very cheap compared to bankers. But we've decided through a market mechanism that whatever they could do wasn't worth paying for, and that's quite new. The fourth is a kind of new greed. The idea that greed is good, re-emerging the idea that there isn't an alternative to markets and that you must do things through market mechanisms and choice mechanisms. Even after you've had an almighty crash and things not working, there is no plan B, and that's evidence of a lack of imagination and lack of thinking beyond this basic model. And the last one, I think, is a way in which we've moved from having disease as an evil, the old evil of beverage that we need in the NHS and so on to deal with, to increasing mental ill health, replacing physical disease as the main problem of our health, and an increasing rate of despair and anxiety and distress and depression amongst the population. And again, that's new.